Rome, 100 AD. An emperor walks into the forum wearing a robe so purple it almost glows. The crowd parts. Nobody speaks. Because that color, that specific, deep, unmistakable shade of purple, is illegal for anyone else to wear. The penalty for wearing it without authorization is death. And according to documented Roman historical records, that color cost more per gram than gold. To produce enough dye for a single robe, workers had to harvest and crush more than 10,000 sea snails by hand. The smell alone was so catastrophic that the factories were banned from city limits. This is the true story of the most expensive color in human history. The Roman world was a world organized by visibility. Status, rank, and authority were meant to be readable at a glance. From across a marketplace, from the back of a crowd, from a distance that made conversation impossible. The toga's draping, the number of rings on the fingers, the quality of the sandal leather, all of these communicated information that Romans read instantly and automatically. And at the very top of this visual hierarchy of power sat a single color: purple. Specifically, the deep, saturated, almost blood-red purple that came from the coastal city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon. The color that Roman historians, including Pliny the Elder in his encyclopedic Naturalis Historia, described with a reverence that makes its commercial origins seem impossible. This was the color of the divine, the color of Caesar, the color that connected the living ruler of Rome to the gods who were supposed to have blessed his reign. Roman law, specifically the sumptuary laws that regulated what different classes of people were permitted to wear, eat, and display, made the ownership and wearing of Tyrian purple a carefully graduated privilege. Full Tyrian purple, the deepest and most saturated shade, was reserved for the emperor alone. Lighter gradations of purple, mixed with other dyes, producing less intense shades, were permitted to specific ranks of senators and magistrates. For ordinary Roman citizens, any attempt to wear full Tyrian purple was not a fashion violation. According to the historical record, it was a capital offense. The origins of Tyrian purple as a dye are documented in both historical records and mythology, which in the ancient Mediterranean world were often the same thing told at different scales. According to the mythological tradition recorded by multiple ancient authors, the discovery of the dye was made by the dog of the hero Hercules, who was walking along the Phoenician coast and bit into a sea snail. The dog's mouth turned a deep, brilliant purple. Hercules, observing this, recognized immediately that something extraordinary had been found. The historical reality behind this origin story involves the Phoenicians, the seafaring civilization based along the coast of what is now Lebanon and Syria, who were producing and trading purple dye from the coastal city of Tyre for at least 1,000 years before Rome became a major power. According to archaeological evidence and ancient commercial records, Tyrian purple was already a luxury trade good of the highest value in the Bronze Age Mediterranean world, appearing in records from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean as a marker of extraordinary wealth and status. The snail responsible was the murex, specifically several related species of the Muricidae family found in the Mediterranean. What the Phoenicians had discovered, through centuries of coastal observation and experiment, was that a specific gland in the body of this snail produced a secretion that, when exposed to air and sunlight through a carefully managed process, transformed through a sequence of colors, yellow, green, blue, before arriving at a deep purple red that did not fade. In a world where almost all other dyes faded with washing and sunlight, this property was extraordinary. A purple robe dyed with murex secretion actually intensified in color when exposed to the sun. The longer you wore it, the more vivid it became. The production process for Tyrian Purple is documented in detail by Pliny the Elder, who describes it with the combination of scientific precision and barely concealed amazement that characterizes his best writing. What he describes is one of the most labor-intensive and physically unpleasant manufacturing processes in the ancient world. The first step was catching the snails. Murex. Snails were harvested from the Mediterranean using baited traps. Meat that had begun to decompose attracted the carnivorous snails in sufficient numbers for commercial harvesting. The traps were deployed in shallow coastal waters, pulled up regularly, and the snails transported to the processing facility. Hundreds of thousands of snails were required for any meaningful quantity of dye, and they needed to be processed while still alive or very recently dead, because the chemical that produced the color degraded quickly after the snail died. The processing itself had two documented methods. The first involved cracking the shell and extracting the specific gland, the hypobranchial gland, a small yellowish organ located in the snail's mantle cavity, by hand, one snail at a time. The second method, used for smaller snails or in higher volume operations, involved crushing the entire snail and soaking the mass in salt water. In either case, the resulting liquid was then left in open vats, large stone or lead tanks documented archaeologically at Phoenician and Roman dye production sites, and exposed to both air and sunlight in a carefully managed sequence. The smell of this process was, according to ancient sources, genuinely catastrophic. The decomposition of marine organic matter, combined with the sulfur compounds released as the dye chemistry developed, produced an odor that ancient writers describe with unusual specificity as one of the worst smells in the known world. Roman law required that dye production facilities be located outside city limits. The workers who operated them carried the smell in their skin and clothing to a degree that made their profession immediately identifiable at any distance. The numbers behind Tyrian Purple production are the numbers that explain everything about its price, its exclusivity, and the scale of environmental impact that the industry generated. These numbers are documented in ancient sources and confirmed by modern experimental archaeology. Researchers who have reconstructed the ancient process in laboratory conditions and measured the output. According to the experimental work conducted by researchers including those associated with the Natural Dye Archive and various classical archaeology programs, approximately 12,000 murex snails yield roughly 1.5 grams of usable dye. 1.5 grams. A quantity that would sit comfortably on the tip of a finger. To produce enough dye to saturate a single Roman toga, a full-length garment requiring deep, rich coloration throughout, required somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 snails, depending on the depth of color desired and the specific dyeing technique used. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, records the price of Tyrian purple dyed wool as roughly equivalent to its weight in silver, with the most intensely dyed grades approaching the price of gold by weight. In modern terms, based on historical price analysis by classical economists, a pound of the finest Tyrian purple dye was worth approximately 3 to 5 times the daily wage of a skilled Roman craftsman for a single pound of liquid dye. The finished garment, after the labor of dyeing was added, cost more than most Roman citizens earned in a year. The environmental consequences of this industry at scale were significant and archaeologically documented. Coastal sites associated with ancient dye production, most notably the area around ancient Sidon and Tyre in modern Lebanon, and the island of Mogador off the coast of Morocco, have yielded enormous shell mounds. Archaeological surveys have found mounds of crushed murex shells tens of meters in height and hundreds of meters in extent, representing the processed remains of millions upon millions of harvested snails across centuries of production. The purple of the Roman world was not a single color. It was a spectrum, and every position on that spectrum communicated a specific social and political meaning that educated Romans read as precisely as a modern person reads a uniform or a rank insignia. The system was documented in Roman legal and administrative texts and enforced through a combination of law, social pressure, and occasional violent example. At the top of the hierarchy sat Purpura Tyria, full Tyrian purple, the deepest and most saturated shade achievable through the standard murex process. This color was reserved exclusively for the emperor, not for his family, not for his generals, not for the most powerful senator in Rome, for the emperor alone. The emperor's purple was so specifically his that wearing it without authority was not described in Roman sources as impersonation or fraud. It was described as an act of treason, because claiming the emperor's color was claiming the emperor's position. Below full imperial purple, the spectrum descended through carefully calibrated gradations. Senior magistrates and certain categories of senator were entitled to wear clothing with purple stripes, the latus clavus, the broad purple stripe on the toga, but not fully purple garments. Military commanders celebrating a triumph wore purple for the duration of the ceremony. Priests of certain cults used purple in ritual contexts. Each of these usages was defined, authorized, and monitored. The psychological dimension of this color hierarchy was documented by Roman writers who described the instant, almost physical impact of seeing the imperial purple in person. The color communicated power before any words were spoken, before any symbols of office were displayed. It worked on a level that bypassed rational evaluation and triggered an immediate response of recognition and deference. The Romans understood this effect and engineered their visual culture around it with considerable sophistication. The production and trade of Tyrian purple operated for much of the Roman imperial period as a state monopoly, or as close to one as Roman administrative capacity could manage. According to historical records, the imperial government maintained direct control over the most important dye production facilities, particularly those in the eastern Mediterranean, where the best quality murex were found. This control made purple dye not just a luxury commodity, but a strategic resource, in the same category as grain supply or military equipment. The black market in purple was, predictably, substantial. Roman legal texts and historical accounts document the persistent problem of unauthorized purple production and sale, operations that tried to produce convincing approximations of the genuine Tyrian shade using cheaper materials, or that attempted to access genuine murex dye through unauthorized channels. The penalties for illegal purple production were severe, but the profit margins were sufficiently extraordinary that the risk calculation apparently remained attractive to a consistent supply of entrepreneurs. The substitute purple dyes that operated in this grey and black market used several different sources. Kermes, a dye derived from a scale insect found on Mediterranean oak trees, produced a red purple that could approximate the genuine article in poor lighting. Madder root, properly prepared, yielded a range of reds and purples. Indigo combined with madder could simulate purple convincingly to an untrained eye. Roman quality inspectors, officials whose specific function was to identify unauthorized purple, developed expertise in distinguishing genuine Tyrian purple from its imitations, because the difference in the specific shade, the depth, and the behavior of the color under different lighting conditions was detectable to people who knew what they were looking at. The history of Tyrian purple, as written by ancient sources, is almost entirely a history of the color itself, its properties, its price, its social significance, its political meaning. The history of the people who made it occupies almost no space in the ancient record. This absence is itself historically significant. The workers who processed murex snails by the million were, by all available evidence, operating at the lowest levels of the Roman social and economic hierarchy. Slaves. Freed persons working in conditions little better than slavery. The poorest free workers doing the most unpleasant work for the least compensation to produce the most valuable product in the empire. The physical consequences of the work were documented indirectly in ancient sources that mention the distinctive appearance of dye workers, specifically the permanent staining of hands, forearms, and clothing that resulted from handling large quantities of murex secretion during processing. The dye that was so prized when applied to imperial robes was, in its working form, impossible to remove from skin. Workers in dye production facilities were permanently marked by their occupation in a way that was visible and immediately recognizable. Their stained hands were the inverse of the emperor's purple robe, the same material, the same color, but communicating the opposite social message. The communities built around dye production, the fishing communities that harvested the snails, the processing workers at the vat facilities, the merchants who moved the dye inland from coastal production centers, developed their own economic ecosystems that were entirely dependent on the continued demand for the product at the top of the social pyramid. When that demand eventually collapsed with the empire that sustained it, those communities lost their primary economic function entirely. The physical evidence for the Tyrian purple industry is among the most dramatic and tangible archaeological records of any ancient industry. Unlike the paper records and administrative documents that document most Roman economic activity, materials that survive only in exceptional circumstances, the waste product of murex dye production is stone. Or rather, it is the calcium carbonate shells of millions of harvested snails, which do not decompose and which accumulate into formations that archaeologists can identify, excavate, and analyze thousands of years after the industry that produced them ceased to exist. The shell mounds at ancient Tyre, now the city of Sur in southern Lebanon, were documented by 19th century archaeologists and have been studied continuously since then. Similar mounds have been identified at Sidon, at ancient Mogador on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, at various sites in Greece and the Aegean, and at multiple locations along the North African Mediterranean coast. The sheer physical scale of some of these deposits, covering areas of thousands of square meters to depths of several meters, allows researchers to estimate the volume of snail processing that occurred at specific sites over specific time periods. Chemical analysis of residue from ancient stone vats found at dye production sites has confirmed the presence of the specific indigoid compounds that constitute genuine Tyrian purple dye. These vats, large stone basins cut into coastal rock or constructed from carefully fitted stone blocks, preserve traces of the chemistry that operated within them. Experimental archaeologists have used these chemical signatures, combined with the ancient literary descriptions of the production process, to reconstruct the full sequence of steps that ancient dye workers followed, confirming that the process described by Pliny and other ancient sources actually produces the distinctive color that the historical record describes. The fall of Tyrian purple as the world's most valuable color is a story that tracks the fall of the civilization that made it meaningful. The Western Roman Empire collapsed across the 5th century AD, not in a single dramatic moment, but through a long deterioration of administrative capacity, military effectiveness, and economic coherence that left different parts of the empire failing at different rates. The dye industry, like the empire's other sophisticated manufacturing and trade networks, declined as the systems that organized and protected it ceased to function. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine state centered on Constantinople, which continued as a functioning empire for nearly 1,000 years after the Western collapse, maintained the imperial purple tradition with conscious deliberateness. Byzantine emperors used purple as extensively as their Roman predecessors, and the purple dye industry of the Eastern Mediterranean continued under imperial patronage. The term "born in the purple," porphyrogenitos in Greek, referred specifically to children born in the purple-decorated imperial birthing chamber of the Constantinople palace, and was a mark of the highest possible legitimacy. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD, the surviving knowledge of authentic Tyrian purple production, closely guarded as an imperial secret for centuries, was effectively lost. The specific techniques, the proportions, the timing of the process that produced the genuine color were not preserved in any surviving text complete enough to reconstruct the full method without experimentation. The modern recovery of the color came in 1856, when an 18-year-old English chemistry student named William Henry Perkin accidentally produced a synthetic purple, which he called movine, while attempting to synthesize quinine. The industrial production of synthetic purple dye that followed within years of his discovery made purple clothing accessible to anyone who could afford cheap fabric. The color that had once been worth more than gold became ordinary. Within a generation, purple was available in every fabric shop in Europe. The full arc of Tyrian purple, from the Phoenician coast where murex snails were first harvested in commercial quantities, through the Roman imperial system that made the color the most legally protected substance in the empire, to the Byzantine palace where emperors were literally born into rooms decorated with it, to the moment in 1856 when a teenager accidentally made it available to everyone, is one of the most complete stories about the relationship between scarcity, value, and power that history has preserved. The lesson is not simply that rare things are expensive. It is that the value of rare things is always partly constructed, built through law, enforced through violence, maintained through cultural agreement, and capable of collapsing entirely when the systems that maintained the scarcity fail. The Tyrian purple that cost more than gold in 100 AD costs nothing today. The snails still exist. The chemistry still works. William Perkin's synthetic alternative simply made the scarcity irrelevant. According to the historical record, the purple that Roman emperors wore required 10,000 snail deaths, months of labor, and facilities so foul-smelling that they were banned from cities. The workers who produced it were permanently stained by the process, wearing the mark of their labor in a color that their social position prevented them from wearing in any other context. The emperor who wore the final product knew none of this, or chose not to think about it. That gap between the cost of a luxury and the experience of consuming it is not unique to ancient Rome. It is a structural feature of how luxury has always worked. What the history of Tyrian Purple asks us to consider is what we are currently agreeing, through law, through culture, through the systems we participate in, to treat as the purple of our own time. What is the thing whose value depends on most people not having it? What is the industry behind it that we prefer not to examine? The Romans had their answer dyed into the emperor's robe. Ours may be less visible, but it is no less present.